A knock at the door, a child outside, a calm voice asking a simple question, "Can we come in?" And before there is any explanation, before there is any clearly supernatural detail, the feeling is already there, the immediate sense that something is wrong. Different people in different places describing almost the same thing. Not the same face, not the same street, not the same night, but almost the same pattern. A request for help, a request for permission, a voice that sounds too calm, and fear that appears too quickly to feel rational. The black eyes are the detail most people remember, but maybe that is not the most disturbing part, because what keeps this phenomenon alive is the fact that so many separate stories keep returning to almost the same logic. So the real question is not just what black-eyed children are. It is this: why do different accounts keep repeating almost the same pattern? The so-called black-eyed children, or black-eyed kids, are usually treated as part of modern folklore. In most of these stories, they're described as children or teenagers who seem ordinary at first glance, but cause immediate discomfort. They usually appear at night in ordinary places: a house, a parked car, a quiet street, a window, a door. They ask for help, a ride, to use a phone, or more often, permission to come inside. And in many accounts, something feels wrong before any visual detail fully registers. Only then comes the feature that made the phenomenon famous: the eyes, completely black, no visible white, nothing familiar in them. But even from a skeptical point of view, that visual detail alone does not explain why these stories continue to circulate. What makes the phenomenon more disturbing is the combination of behavior, insistence, proximity, and a sense of threat that seems to arrive before logic does. Among the stories most often connected to this phenomenon, one name appears again and again: Brian Bethel. For many people, his account helped define the modern form of the legend. According to the best-known version of the story, this happened in Abilene, Texas in 1996. Bethel had stopped his car late at night outside a shopping center and was sitting there writing a check. It was a completely normal setting, the kind of place where nothing should feel out of place. Then he realized he was not alone. Outside the car, there were two boys. At first, nothing about the encounter seemed impossible. They did not appear as monsters. They were simply there, standing beside the car. And that is part of what makes the story work. It does not begin with the impossible. It begins with the plausible. The boys asked for help. They wanted a ride. Their explanation sounded simple. They needed to go to their mother's house to get money and then come back to see a movie. Nothing about that should have triggered panic on its own. But Bethel described something that appears again and again in stories like this: the feeling that something was deeply wrong before there was any clear reason to justify it. It wasn't just the request, it was the whole situation, the hour, the way they spoke, the insistence, the sense that they were trying to cross some invisible line, not just the door of the car, but a boundary of trust. As the conversation continued, the discomfort grew. The explanation sounded simple, but certain details did not fit. And then came the detail that transformed the story into something much larger: the eyes, completely black, no visible white, nothing recognizably human. That is where the story changes. Until that moment, everything could still be dismissed as unease, coincidence, or an exaggerated impression. But once that detail appears, the encounter stops feeling merely uncomfortable. It becomes threatening. Bethel does not open the door. He does not agree to help them, and he leaves immediately. The story offers no explanation, no resolution, no revealed identity. It ends the way many of these stories end, with retreat, fear, and the feeling that something was avoided but never understood. And that is exactly why this account became so central, because it contains almost everything people now associate with the phenomenon: an ordinary setting, a gradual approach, a request for access, strange behavior, immediate danger, and no clear explanation. If that story were completely isolated, it might be remembered as nothing more than a strange encounter. But that is not how this theme survived. What keeps black-eyed children unsettling is that the Bethel account did not remain alone for long. Over time, other stories began to appear. Different places, different people, different contexts, and yet the same elements kept returning. These stories almost always happen in ordinary situations: houses, doors, cars, parking lots, quiet streets. That matters because it brings the fear into everyday life. And in many of these stories, the behavior is more unsettling than the appearance. The black eyes are the iconic detail. But before that comes the voice. Too calm, too controlled, too deliberate. The impression is not just that something looks wrong, it is that something seems to be imitating normal human behavior without fully sounding human. Many witnesses also describe fear that arrives immediately, too quickly, too intensely, not as the result of reasoning, but as a warning. And maybe the most important pattern is this: the structure keeps returning: an approach, a request, a barrier, an unusual insistence, a detail that feels wrong, and a witness who backs away before something worse can happen. The details may change, but the pattern keeps returning. That is what turns the subject into a phenomenon, not just a strange story, but a recurring structure that keeps appearing in different forms. Another kind of story reinforces that pattern in an even more unsettling way. A woman alone at home, the middle of the night, silence, and then a knock at the door. Not violent, not an attempted break-in, just a controlled presence, patient. In one of the accounts often mentioned in discussions of the phenomenon, a woman heard a child asking to be let in. According to the story, it was around 3 in the morning. That alone would be unsettling. But the real discomfort did not come from the hour. It came from the way it was happening. The child did not seem lost in any ordinary way, did not sound frightened in a natural way, did not behave like someone who simply needed help. And, as in many other reports of this type, the dominant feeling was not sympathy, it was danger. The witness does not open the door, and the story ends the way many of these accounts end. No direct attack, no proof, no final explanation, only the feeling that refusing access was the only safe decision. That matters because it preserves the same core structure as the main case, but in a different setting. Now it is not a car, it is a door. And after that point, what matters is not a third major case. What matters is recurrence, a sequence of elements that keeps reappearing from story to story. 2 young figures standing together, or a single child asking to be let inside, clothes that seem strange, a posture that feels too controlled, language that sounds unusual, almost rehearsed. In some stories, they are on the porch, in others, at the window, in others, beside a parked car. Almost always, there is a barrier, a door, a pane of glass, a short distance, but still a protected one. And almost always, there is a request: open the door, let us in, help us, take us with you. That repeated structure is part of what made the phenomenon spread so easily. Once the pattern became recognizable, it became easier for the story to circulate. Black-eyed children are not usually treated as a documented phenomenon in the traditional sense. They belong more to the realm of modern folklore, a contemporary legend that gained traction in the late 1990s and spread through the internet. One account draws attention, it circulates, it is repeated, new details are added, other stories begin to resemble it. Over time, the pattern becomes established, and that explains part of the mystery, but only part of it. And that is where the most relevant skeptical reading comes in. The simplest explanation may be that black-eyed children are a modern urban legend, a highly effective story structure, easy to remember, easy to repeat, difficult to forget. From that perspective, the recurring pattern would not exist because some external phenomenon is repeating. It would exist because a strong narrative structure was absorbed and reproduced. The internet amplified that process. A famous early account influenced later ones. Expectations shaped memory, suggestion did the rest. In some cases, fear, confusion, distorted memory, or even experiences on the edge of sleep may later have been interpreted through the black-eyed children framework. That reading is plausible, and honestly, it explains a lot. It explains why the subject spread, why the pattern became standardized, why so many later accounts seem to echo the same structure. But maybe it does not explain everything in the way people want it to. Because the central issue was never just, are they real? The central issue was this: why does this specific formula keep returning so consistently? Even within a completely rational reading, the discomfort does not disappear entirely. Because one thing is to say the phenomenon spread culturally, another is to look at what keeps repeating inside it. The pattern is unusually specific. They appear in ordinary settings, they ask for access, they speak in an unnatural way, they trigger fear before logic, and they force the witness to decide whether to open a barrier or not. Maybe that is exactly why the theme has endured. It touches something basic, the idea that danger does not always arrive with obvious violence. Sometimes it knocks politely. Sometimes it asks for help. Sometimes it appears almost normal, until the moment it doesn't. And maybe that is why these stories remain memorable, even for skeptical audiences. Not because they prove anything, but because they explore a very particular fear, the fear of letting in something we do not understand. In the end, black-eyed children may be exactly what the skeptical view says they are: modern folklore. A collective narrative shaped by fear, repetition, the internet, and imagination. They may also be a clear example of how certain stories become powerful because they remain plausible for just a few seconds longer than they should. But even so, something remains difficult to ignore. Not the proof, because there is none. Not the appearance, because that can be exaggerated, reconstructed, or reinterpreted. But the pattern, the recurring logic, the repeated sensation, the near-identical structure emerging across separate stories. And maybe the most unsettling part is not what these people claim to have seen. Maybe it is the fact that so many of them continue describing almost the same thing. And cases like this remain compelling for the same reason others do. Not because they give us answers, but because they leave something unresolved. If that kind of pattern interests you, there are other stories like this here, cases where the explanation gets close, but never fully closes the door.